Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Michael Shepard, I'm Tyler Kendall.
Tonight, less than 72 hours after the Trump-Putin summit in Anchorage, Alaska, Europe comes to Washington.
The war is going to end. When it ends, I can't tell you, but the war is going to end, and this gentleman wants it to end, and Vladimir Putin wants it to end. I think the whole world is tired of it, and we're going to get it ended.
The intense lobbying effort from Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelenskiy and Europe's top leaders pleading with President Trump to stand behind Ukraine after his meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin on Friday. What both sides came away with after a scene that looked akin to the G7 happening at the White House.
Plus, what the ongoing war could mean for crude and Russia's lucrative oil business following stepped-up attacks on its energy infrastructure, with a key strike on its pipeline system launched today by Ukraine, halting oil to Hungary and Slovakia just as President Zelenskiy flew to Washington.
Also tonight, a Bloomberg exclusive, the Trump administration in talks to take a 10% stake in embattled chip maker Intel, a move that could see the U.S. become Intel's largest shareholder. The details and how the market reacted up ahead.
And Jackson Hole Week kicks off in Wyoming. The quiet start to the key Federal Reserve week after a series of all-time highs for the S&P. We'll discuss the big week for the central bank as investors keep an eye on the symposium and what Chair Jerome Powell may say about those potential rate cuts next month.
But we begin tonight with a deep dive into today's historic meeting at the White House. The day started off with a bilateral meeting between President Trump and Ukrainian President Zelenskiy. Follows Friday's Alaska summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin, and both Trump and Zelensky spoke with reporters as the meeting kicked off.
We need to stop this war, to stop Russia, and we need support American and European partners. We will do our best for this.
If everything works out well today, we'll have a trilat, and I think there will be a reasonable chance of ending the war when we do that.
It was the second time Zelensky met with Trump this year, but this go-round, he came with backup, joined by leaders from the European Union pressing the case for a durable ceasefire in the war in Ukraine.
We have the big news covered for you across the country with Bloomberg's Eric Martin here in Washington, Tony Halpin in San Francisco, and Romaine Bostick in our global headquarters in New York. But we begin with Eric Martin from the White House. Eric, thanks so much for being here. Can we just talk about what we learned today? What progress, if at all, have we heard from this White House when it comes to these meetings?
Tyler, I think the most important thing, arguably, that we've heard today is the tone coming out of these meetings. The tone has been so positive coming from President Trump and his European counterparts. We had this kind of remarkable moment at the beginning of their multilateral meeting where President Trump was going around and complimenting each and every one of them, talking about Merce with saying that he looked tan, talking about Giorgia Meloni, Prime Minister of Italy, and saying that she's going to be Prime Minister for a long time. Positive things about Macron, about everybody, Starmer, everyone there. And also the tone with President Zelenskiy, of course, was a complete 180 from what we saw 6 months ago. President Trump and President Zelenskiy having a real positive rapport, at least publicly, and also seeing a remarkable picture coming out from Dan Scavino, a aide to President Trump, looking at, or showing in the Oval Office, President Zelenskiy and President Trump looking at a map and studying a map of Ukraine. And one of the main things that we're looking to see is what, if any, land concessions are possible on the Ukrainian side, because that's been one of the most contentious areas and one of the most contentious topics under discussion, seeking a potential peace agreement.
Bloomberg's Eric Martin, thank you. 7 of Europe's top leaders were alongside President Zelensky at the White House today, each one speaking before the full group, discussing the ongoing war in Ukraine behind closed doors. The EU leaders highlighting the existential moment facing the bloc, with Putin on the verge of potentially increasing Russia's footprint following hundreds of thousands of deaths since Moscow invaded in February 2022. For a look into how Europe is watching today's meeting at the White House, we're joined by Bloomberg's Tony Halpin. Tony, we have to ask, how is this all playing out in Europe? How is the sentiment there as they look at President Donald Trump racing to reach some sort of deal between Russia and Ukraine to resolve this war?
Yes, Michael. I mean, behind the good humor and the gratitude towards President Trump for organizing the meeting, there's serious concern in Europe that they may be maneuvered into a position where Russia ends up gaining territory in Ukraine as the price of a peace deal, and therefore forcibly changing the borders of Europe, and that Europeans then may be left to police this peace deal, which would amount for them to a large commitment in defense terms, because it's not very clear to them at the current moment what US support may be available to ensure that there are security guarantees for Ukraine that will stick.
Well, Tony, can we also talk about the optics of what we're seeing play out here at the White House? Half a dozen European leaders, some of which I think it's fair to say have relatively warmer relationships with President Trump. He complimented many of them, as we heard Eric say. I'm thinking about the Italian Prime Minister Meloni, also with the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. How does that paint the backdrop here for these leaders? How could that change the dynamic as we are talking about these meetings happening inside the White House?
Yes, the Europeans are in a very difficult spot because they watched Friday's meeting between President Trump and President Putin in Alaska. And frankly, they were appalled, most of them, because they saw the end result of that summit was that President Trump was aligning much more with Vladimir Putin's view of how to resolve this war. So the reason that so many of them are here now today in Washington is to try and backstop President Zelenskiy of Ukraine, to try and ensure that President Trump doesn't give away too much of the shop in reaching an agreement that would be acceptable to President Putin. Because, as I said before, they know that they may end up having to police this agreement, and that would amount to a very big commitment of European forces on the ground, something currently that Russia opposes and would be hostile to. So they're very keen to understand what support the US is willing to give in the event of any agreement that does indeed end the war.
All right. Bloomberg's Tony Halpin, we thank you so much for your reporting and coverage. And joining us now with more insight here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio is retired Rear Admiral Mike Hewitt, who served 31 years in the U.S. Navy. He's currently the co-chair of the upcoming Ukraine Reconstruction Summit, which is an event that will gather global leaders, investors, and policymakers focused on rebuilding Ukraine's future. Admiral Hewitt, thanks so much for joining Bloomberg. We heard President Trump say today that in a week or two, they will know if they can solve this. We also had the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, over the weekend say, quote, "We are not at the precipice of a peace agreement, but I do think progress was made." So, Admiral, in your view, how should we be measuring progress as these meetings are underway?
You know, it's a great question. And in some cases, you have to measure progress based on what has President Trump done since the inauguration in terms of his foreign policy successes, where he's had several conflicts come to resolution, his domestic successes. And without putting himself into a position of strength as he's done, it would have been terribly challenging to have that first meeting with Putin. I found that first meeting, the expectation was way too high for what people expected to come from it. We should have been happy that there was a second meeting. And that second meeting is what's taking place today. And these 7 European leaders that have come to Washington, I don't believe they're there to ensure that Zelenskyy's interests are protected. I believe they're there to make sure the United States remains engaged on this conflict, because it was only Donald Trump that got that meeting into position that it was in. And it was also Donald Trump that got those same nations, plus the other NATO nations, to go to 5% of their GDP to fight Russia. So you don't get to an end to the war or a ceasefire, and you're certainly not going to be able to talk about territory or frozen assets or membership in NATO until you get to this ceasefire. So I believe we're at an incredibly fast pace of play, considering where we were just 5 days ago.
Admiral, earlier this afternoon, President Trump shared more about the security guarantees that he discussed with Vladimir Putin. Let's have a listen.
In a very significant step, President Putin agreed that Russia would accept security guarantees for Ukraine, and this is one of the key points that we need to consider, and we're going to be considering that at the table also, like who will do what, essentially. I'm optimistic that collectively we can reach an agreement that would deter any future aggression against Ukraine. And I think that the European nations are going to take a lot of the burden. We're going to help them, and we're going to make it very secure.
Admiral, we heard the president talking about security guarantees as being a component of whatever peace plan might emerge. But are you hearing very many specifics in there, and perhaps anything that would be enough to offer the reassurance that Volodymyr Zelensky would be seeking?
I think President Trump knows who he's dealing with Vladimir Putin, and sometimes that gets lost in the conversation. President Putin will violate whatever agreement is signed, when and if he can, but for certain, he has no intention of honoring any agreement. We've seen that since the Budapest memo all the way up to the invasion of Crimea, and then, of course, his invasion of the sovereign country of Ukraine. So this is not as if President Trump is trying to capitulate with a reasonable person. He knows who he is dealing with. This is the most important part of the conversation, are the security guarantees. Push NATO aside. That's not where we're going to come to a resolution. But the kind of security guarantees that he is offering are similar to Article 5 of NATO, in that these countries guarantee the sovereignty of Ukraine from any threats from Russia now or in the future. And then what President Trump will do is take that security guarantee, which again, I wouldn't trust Putin more than anyone else would on this, but then bolster it with massive commercial entanglement, reconstruction, critical minerals, and ensure that Ukraine is the ally that can protect itself from a sovereign perspective. So these security guarantees will also include, I suspect, a large buildup of the Ukrainian military.
Right, and that goes to Ukrainian President Zelensky's point when asked directly what sort of security guarantees he would like to see. He replied everything. And Admiral, I want to go back to something earlier that you mentioned when it comes to the concept of a ceasefire, because now we have seen President Trump pushing for a full deal, saying that he likes the idea of a ceasefire, but he doesn't think that it is necessary. What is the strategic reason here? Is this providing a sense of urgency, or is this allowing Vladimir Putin to buy more time?
Well, that's a great question, because a ceasefire, in many respects, allows Vladimir Putin to rearm and reload. And so, in some respects, a ceasefire may play more into Russia's hands than Ukraine's hands. So I think recognizing that he's going to continue the terrorism and the civilian attacks and the things that he's doing until we reach some form of an agreement bypasses a ceasefire, but gets us onto the topics that can create what I would call a sustainable peace plan. And I think Putin is not in as a strong position as others believe, because the president has the ability with sanctions and tariffs to put a tremendous amount of pressure on Ukraine economically. They're a petro economy. He did not go to the Middle East to broker deals with the OPEC nations without thinking about this negotiation. So what we need are security guarantees that get to a long-term peace agreement, and a ceasefire at this point in time won't achieve those goals.
Admiral Hewitt, in the 30 seconds that we have left, where do you see this headed in terms of the rebuilding process? That would be the next step after whatever peace plan may emerge.
I think this is the most important next step. Similar to South Korea at the end of that conflict, or Japan at the end of World War II, what America did was invest in the long-term security and the alliance of the nation that had just suffered the war. That is where Ukraine is. Ukraine is an unbelievable asset and ally of America. It's a democracy. It's a values-based democracy. It has tremendous resources in critical minerals, AI, military industrial base. So we win this war by winning the peace. And the peace is economic entanglement between U.S. and Ukrainian companies. And that is why I'm part of the Ukrainian Reconstruction Summit next month here in Washington.
Retired Rear Admiral Mike Hewitt, thank you. A quiet start on Wall Street today, but that will likely pick up by the end of the week as focus turns to the Fed's annual Economic Policy Symposium in Jackson Hole. For the details, we turn now to power moves with Romaine Bostick, who joins us live from World Headquarters in New York. Romaine, how are markets digesting what we saw unfold today in Washington at the White House?
It's kind of interesting here, Mike. We talk about a week that's going to be bookended by two big events. Of course, the Ukrainian talks today. You did not see a whole lot of market movement on the back of that, largely because, at least as of right now, we have not seen any sort of material resolution or any sort of material movement towards some sort of peace deal or some sort of negotiated settlement. Of course, at the end of the week, we do get Jay Powell scheduled to give a speech on Friday at the Jackson Hole Symposium, a speech, of course, that comes amid hard conviction right now in the markets that the Fed will indeed start cutting rates at its mid-September meeting. And everyone wants to know whether Jay Powell is going to try to telegraph that to the market during his speech. You take a look at the screen there and you see modest movements in the Treasury space, but those yields actually move to the upside. If the market is betting on a cut in rates, you would expect those rates to move slightly lower here. Overall, this is a market that has been in a little bit of a stasis, but a market, as you know, Mike, is right now beholden to so many things coming out of Washington. In fact, tethered to every sort of policy announcement, every sort of policy ruction out of the president. And that was no different today, not necessarily in the broad market, but certainly when it comes to individual stocks. Take a look at Intel. This was a stock, of course, that had rallied over the past 6 days and, in fact, was up about 28% over the past 2 weeks. It gave up some of those gains today, down about 4%. And this is largely based on Bloomberg reporting that the president is actually considering taking a stake in the chip maker, at least of about 10% here. Now, we did not confirm that with the White House, but reporters who did speak to people familiar with the situation said that this is certainly a plausible scenario, that, of course, that we have seen play out with regards to U.S. Steel, and, of course, that weird 15% kickback agreement when it comes to NVIDIA. So right now, investors really keeping an eye on everything coming out of Washington, whether it's out of the White House or whether it's out of the Fed building, and that, of course, will drive the trade and maybe a little bit more volatility as we get deeper into the week.
All right, always a lot for us to follow here. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, we thank you so much. And coming up, a look into how oil markets are watching these latest developments between Russia and Ukraine as they unfold. We'll have Bob McNally of the Rapidan Energy Group. But first, we'll continue our conversation on what's next for Vladimir Putin after today's meeting with Maria Snegovaya of CSIS. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Michael Shepard. I'm Tyler Kendall. Leaders from across Europe traveling to the White House today in a sign of solidarity with Ukraine. Take a listen to what they said about the status of negotiations earlier.
I think that we had very good conversation with President Trump.
Very good.
And it really was the best one, maybe the best one will be in the future.
I think if we play this well, we could end this. And we have to end this. We have to stop the killing. We have to stop the destruction of Ukraine's infrastructure.
Now we are here to work together with you on a just and lasting peace for Ukraine. Stop the killing. This is really our common interest. Stop the killing.
The next steps ahead are the more complicated ones now. The path is open. You opened it last Friday. But now the way is open for complicated negotiations.
Everybody around this table is in favor of peace. And we work very hard, and we've worked very hard during the past few years to have a peace which is a robust and long-standing peace.
Joining us now for more here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio is Maria Snegovaya, a senior fellow for Russia and Eurasia at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Maria, thanks so much for joining us here. President Trump, we heard earlier today, said that he is going to call Russian President Vladimir Putin directly after these meetings at the White House. Can you give us some context into how we've seen the relationship between these two leaders evolve? Because in the frequent months, we saw President Trump grow frustrated with Vladimir Putin, even setting a deadline for him to come to the negotiating table.
Absolutely. Well, it seems that President Trump believes that he has a special relationship with Vladimir Putin. During his first term, he was on record saying nice things about Putin in general. He avoids criticizing him, and that was his conviction during his first months into his second term, that he will be able to find some sort of quick settlement with Putin. Over the months, as you flagged, he grew increasingly more frustrated because the Kremlin has shown no significant willingness to negotiate. And in fact, since Trump's taken the office again this year, the amount of airstrikes of Russia on Ukraine has actually doubled at the very least. So that's certainly no evidence of Russia willing to negotiate. But Trump is very committed to pushing forward this deal on Ukraine, and as a result, he seems to be convinced that Putin wants some sort of deal to be achieved. The lot of details remains to be seen. So far, as of Friday's meeting, we can definitely say that it has given certain credibility, certain boost to Putin's at least domestic approval. When it comes to substantive outcome takeaway from this meeting, it remains to be seen. It seems that the key kind of shift in the Kremlin posture is some sort of decrease in the territorial claims. Now Russia mostly wants the rest of the Donetsk region, other than the other three regions territory, which it claimed before. And in addition to that, allegedly is open to some security guarantees for Ukraine. The problem with that is that Russia never openly said that it rejects any security guarantees for Ukraine. If you look at the Istanbul agreements, which were agreed in 2022, those were already in those agreements. The problem is those not good enough for Ukraine. And the key intrigue of this coming negotiations between the European leaders, Ukraine and Trump, is whether there is indeed some sort of change in Russia's posture on this particular topic.
Maria, what did Vladimir Putin and his team learn about Donald Trump and the leadership around him as they met on Friday? Was there any new information or even intelligence that they were able to gather in that moment that they might be able to use going forward?
I guess a lot of details of the meeting actually remain to be perhaps discovered. In fact, we have seen on Friday that the meeting was cut short, right? A lot of the events which was scheduled original, like the luncheon between the presidents, did not take place, which made many analysts suspect that the meeting did not go as well as original planned. We can only say that the regional key talking points that Putin held since the start of the war, of his aggression in Ukraine, including, quote unquote, eliminating the key roots of this conflict, which frankly mean in Kremlin talk, Ukraine sovereignty, that very much remained on the agenda, along with these historical cards of Ukraine, some historical books that Putin allegedly gave to President Trump. So from that perspective, it seems that the Kremlin, at least in its major approach to the war, has held on to its key talking points. But it's also very obvious to the Kremlin that the US president is very eager to negotiate. And the key danger here is that the Kremlin will be apt at using this eagerness in order to turn it in its favor.
Maria Snegovaya, Senior Fellow for Russia and Eurasia at CSIS, thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up, how today's multilateral meeting could impact oil markets and Russian President Putin's ability to generate revenue. We'll discuss that with Bob McNally of Rapidan Energy Group next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Tyler Kendall, I'm Michael Shepard. Much more on the unprecedented series of meetings today at the White House when we convene our political panel up ahead. But first, here are the stories that we're watching in today's Power Brief. Hamas and Israel both being prodded to end the fighting in Gaza, but from different directions. A day after 500,000 Israelis held a nationwide strike urging Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to halt the war and win the release of hostages, Hamas said it had agreed to a ceasefire deal backed by Qatar and Egypt. A diplomat briefed on the talks said the terms were almost in line with those advanced in May by U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. But it wasn't clear whether Israel had even received the proposal yet.
Plus, former Attorney General Bill Barr was back on Capitol Hill today as part of the House Oversight Committee's investigation into convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. Bill Barr is the former first government official to appear before the committee after it issued 13 subpoenas related to the case. Barr served as Attorney General during the first Trump administration and oversaw the Justice Department in August of 2019. That's when Epstein was found dead in his New York cell after he was indicted for charges that included the sex trafficking of minors. The House investigation comes after the FBI released a memo last month reversing a promise to release the files. In a statement tonight, Oversight Committee Chairman James Comer said the DOJ will begin sharing Epstein records starting on Friday.
Novo Nordisk is slashing the cost of Ozempic for patients who pay cash for the diabetes drug that surged in popularity for its use for weight loss. The company says patients can now get Ozempic for $499 a month, about half of its U.S. list price, through Novo's cash pay pharmacy NovoCare. The Trump administration has been pressuring drug makers to lower prices, although the company says its new offer is unrelated to its discussions with the U.S. government. Novo Nordisk closing the day up about 2.5%.
And Hurricane Erin has re-intensified after moving past Puerto Rico, with the dangerous storm expected to increase in size and remain over the Atlantic Ocean as it turns off the U.S. East Coast later this week. Erin's top wind strengthened to 130 miles per hour, bumping it to a Category 4 storm. Heavy rain is forecast throughout the day across Puerto Rico and the Bahamas, and the storm is expected to pass between North Carolina's Outer Banks and Bermuda later this week. If the storm holds to its forecast track, it will avoid a direct strike on any of the islands in the Caribbean or the U.S. East Coast.
Now we want to turn back to our top story tonight. President Trump's meeting at the White House today with major European leaders, including Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. For a look into the global economic impact of today's discussions, we turn now to Jennifer Welch of Bloomberg Economics. Jenny, thank you so much for joining us today. What is your big takeaway from these meetings, which still haven't ended yet, apparently?
Or they might have just wrapped. So my big takeaway so far is that they seem to have gone well. Trump's initial pressers with President Zelensky and then with the European leaders joining him seemed to be a pretty positive tone, warm vibes. I think the fact that the meeting went along as scheduled, we didn't have an early collapse in the talks, those are all positive signs. But hopefully we'll get the details very soon on what they actually discussed and agreed to.
Well, let's get into that. What do we think that they are actually discussing here behind closed doors? Because there are so many different issues. One, of course, is territory. That seems to be one of the main tension points. But the other has to do with these security guarantees. President Trump has floated perhaps something that could mirror NATO's Article 5. What do we actually know about what this could look like in principle?
So the security guarantees point, as you mentioned, one of the crucial aspects of whether or not any peace deal reached between Russia and Ukraine will actually hold. What it looks like, super ambiguous at this point. Europeans have discussed potentially deploying what they call a reassurance force to Ukraine to essentially be the backstop for any deals reached. President Trump indicating, including over the weekend, that maybe the U.S. is open to sending forces as part of that. But what it would look like, the size of the troops, who's going to pay for it, I think those are some of the details that are being worked out at the moment.
All right. Jennifer Welch of Bloomberg Economics, we always thank you so much for your analysis and insight. For a closer look into the impact on the oil markets, we turn now to Bob McNally, founder and president of Rapidan Energy Group. He was a White House energy advisor under the George W. Bush administration. Bob, it's good to see you, and thanks so much for joining Bloomberg Television and Radio. I want to just start with the price of oil, which settled higher today. Brent crude futures up 1%. So in your view, what isn't priced in right now?
Great to be with you, Tyler. You know, I think the oil markets have become pretty inured to sanctions risk and disruption risk and geopolitical risk. So what isn't in the price of crude right now is a breakdown in talks, President Trump who follows through on his threats to not only keep that penalty tariff of 25% on India for importing Russian oil, but also to extend those secondary tariffs to other major customers of Russia, like possibly China, Turkey, Brazil takes a lot of Russian distillate. And so I think what the market is not expecting and what is not priced in here is that there's going to be any big pain put on Russia's oil exports or revenues at the moment.
Bob, we have seen the president talk about severe consequences for Russia and then stop talking about it really last week. So where are we with that? And how have the sanctions really influenced Russia's behavior, if at all?
So the sanctions under President Biden until now, including under the early Trump months, were designed on purpose to help Russia sell oil. We didn't want to reduce Russia's oil exports because it would have kept oil prices at $127 a barrel. That's where it was for a time there in 2022. So it was designed to help Russia keep selling oil, to keep gasoline prices at home low, while crimping Putin's revenues. Didn't do much on crimping his revenues. Now, President Trump says we're going to change all that. I'm going to go to India and say stop taking your oil. Now, the risk is that that'll send oil prices back up. President Trump says, no problem, we've got shale oil that can compensate. Shale oil cannot compensate. It can't go up by 1 to 2 to 3 million barrels a day, which is what Russia exports, very fast at all. So the challenge is, if we get back into having to put these sanctions in place, which I think the president is willing to do, not just on India, but on other importers, is he willing to accept the oil price increase that would inevitably result, especially if he did it now in the near term. You know, if we look into next year, oil analysts like myself see a softer oil market, a lot more supply, overtaking demand, then it might be a little easier to do without Russia. But right now, I'm afraid you'd be looking at much higher oil prices. So the president has to be a little careful if diplomacy peters out and we're back into sanctions.
Well, I want to drill down on this idea of so-called secondary sanctions, secondary tariffs on those countries that do import Russian oil supplies, because President Trump said over the weekend that as of now, he's not going to lift those tariffs when it comes to China. And he cited his progress in talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Why is China different here? And how does China actually factor in to the global oil market when we are talking about those imports of Russian energy supplies?
So China is the big deal, the biggest deal. It is the largest taker of Russian oil and, for that matter, Iranian oil. Just about all of Iran's oil exports flow to China. So getting China to reduce its imports from Russia and maybe perhaps one day Iran is the biggest win you can have if you're trying to pressure Moscow or Tehran. Now, the challenge is, unlike in India, unlike a Brazil or a smaller country, we have a lot on our plate with China. China showed that it could shut down our auto lines. China has control of magnets. China is a much bigger economic power and trade power. So we have a lot of different equities on the table with China, of which its imports of Russian oil is just one of them. So the president's going to be much more careful with pressuring China, I believe, than he has been, say, within India, where we have less vulnerability, the United States, to India as we do with China.
Bob, when we look at the Russian economy, it has really deteriorated since the invasion back in February 2022. And yet we do see Vladimir Putin meeting with President Donald Trump as if he had more economic leverage to bring to the table. How do you explain that sort of disconnect?
Well, I think the main reason President Trump was met by President Putin and he agreed to come out was President Putin wanted to avoid those sanctions. I mean, we saw with Iran, President Trump, he'll go the last mile in diplomacy. But when he gets frustrated toward the end and he identifies, in this case, Russia as being the impediment to peace, to a deal, he threatens sanctions and he will go through with it. He saw that with Iran. He went the last mile and then ordered an attack on Fordo. So if you're Putin and you're seeing President Trump decide to flip 3 years of diplomacy and say, I don't care, I'm going to go after your oil imports. I'm not like Joe Biden. I'll go to India, I'll go to China. If you're Putin, that's got to terrify you a little bit. And so I think President Putin decided the time had come to try and woo President Trump back onto his side. And by all accounts, he was at least partially successful in Anchorage.
Well, Bob, we had reporting last month that the EU was edging closer to potentially a new price cap regime on Russian oil. A person familiar cautioned that nothing had been determined yet. But in your view, how realistic is that? Is that an option here on the table when we are talking about Russian energy supplies?
You bet. So the Europeans have been in the forefront of imposing energy sanctions on Russia. They were the ones who worked with the United States on that price cap mechanism. My understanding is they indeed have decided to lower the price cap to about $45. It was $60 a barrel. That'll start next month. And so they have squeezed them. More importantly, the EU has passed a rule that says starting in January, there's going to be no more imports of refined products like diesel or gasoline that has been refined using Russian oil in, say, India, and then it comes back to the EU as refined product. Well, they're going to close that loophole. My clients among the trading companies believe that the Europeans are quite serious about that. So while the Europeans have had to be careful and they've loosely enforced their rules to some degree, they have by far gone further than anybody else in punishing Russia's energy exports for the invasion of Ukraine.
Bob, in the 30 seconds we have left, where do you see the critical minerals agreement that was reached with Ukraine factoring into these discussions, if at all?
You know, I think it's important because for President Trump, I think he's going to want to avoid as much as possible a NATO-like commitment. The fewer U.S. troops he has to put on the border, the better. For President Trump, he thinks economically. He thinks in terms of trade. And so I think this critical minerals deal, important in its own right, given the importance of critical minerals in our new economy and for national security, but also by sort of creating that linkage between the United States and Ukraine is one more way of saying, we're behind you, we're not going to let the Russians roll over you if you do a peace agreement. So I think it's multifaceted and very important.
Bob McNally, founder and president of Rapidan Energy Group, thank you. Coming up, we'll continue our conversation on today's multilateral meeting at the White House and its potential impact to end the war in Ukraine. Plus, the fight over redistricting in the U.S. escalates as the Texas State House reconvenes. We assemble our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Tyler Kendall, I'm Michael Shepard. Democrats in Texas have returned to the state after a 2-week standoff over Republican redistricting efforts that could net as many as 5 seats for the GOP in the U.S. House. Democrats successfully stalled the first special session, but Republican Governor Greg Abbott immediately announced a second special session. Now enough lawmakers will be present to meet quorum and move the measure forward.
Meanwhile, state lawmakers in California are back in Sacramento today to consider Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom's plan to counter the Republican redistricting efforts in Texas. That includes a special election on November 4th to get voters' approval for new congressional maps that could add as many as 5 Democratic seats in the U.S. House. Several hearings and key votes are scheduled for this week, which must pass by Friday to get on that November ballot. Here's California State Assembly member Gail Pellegrin earlier today.
We aren't asking Californians to rubber stamp maps drawn behind closed doors. We're putting the maps front and center and giving voters the final say.
Joining us now with reaction to this story and more is this evening's political panel, Bloomberg politics contributor and Democratic analyst Jeannie Shanzano, senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, alongside Republican strategist Ashley Davis, partner at the S3 Group. Ashley, I want to come to you first because, of course, there are razor-thin margins in Congress, which is partly why we're seeing both sides of the aisle here talk about redistricting. How much of a politically charged issue is this going to be heading into 2026?
Well, first of all, good evening. 100% it's a politically charged issue, and it has been for the last 10 years, really, at least, maybe 15. But, I mean, someone that lives in Congress every day, this is just what the problem is in regards to moderates not being really existing anymore. I mean, there's nobody that it's a middle of the road person. And so whatever's happening in Texas, obviously there's going to be 5 seats. I would assume Texas gets 5 seats. I would assume that the ballot passes in November 4th. But this is going to be a tit for tat, which means there's going to be more polarizing issues on both sides of the aisle for the foreseeable future.
Jeannie, as we look at this question of redistricting playing out nationwide, can you give us a sense of how much it has intensified nationally over the years? Have we entered a new level of heat on this issue?
Absolutely. And, we are seeing this in front of our eyes. I can't remember a time in which so many people who weren't involved in politics knew exactly what gerrymandering was and what it meant. But the reality here is that both Republicans and Democrats are playing a dangerous game. And the reason is because we assume that if they redraw these districts, or they're assuming that they're going to win. But they're forgetting you need candidates, you need campaigns, and you have an environment in which all these people have to run, which is why in California you find Republicans, moderate Republicans, concerned that the Republicans are doing this in Texas, and likewise in terms of the Democrats, because they know they have to now face one of their own. They may lose seats that they hold. And also, again, it's politics. We don't know what's going to happen in the midterm. So my view has always been you're better off winning at the ballot box, not trying to choose your voters. It's a very dangerous game.
This morning on Bloomberg Surveillance, Kelly Grieco, senior fellow at the Stimson Center, discussed why NATO membership is not on the table for Ukraine. To get us back to the main topic of the day, let's have a listen to that.
NATO membership is a red line for the Russians. They do not want NATO membership, but this is also why I'm skeptical that the Russians are going to be acceptable with some idea of American or European forces, even in limited numbers, on Ukrainian soil to try to make that kind of Article 5 guarantee credible.
Ashley, when we talk about Ukraine now, it has also been a charged issue domestically, with Republicans expressing reluctance to continue supporting Ukraine. And after the peace plan, there will come the rebuilding. Is the country ready for that conversation?
I mean, listen, this is a horrible war, and the president has been criticized for not being engaged and being engaged. So he has no winning on this topic at all. But I also think that we have to probably have, if they're not going to do NATO, they have to have some sort of peacekeepers in the region, or Zelensky's never going to agree to it, or the European leaders. One thing I want to say is what's being talked about so much is that these European leaders came to support Zelensky. I just want to reiterate that the president invited these European leaders to the White House today. They were invited to our country to come to this meeting. And I think that everyone's losing that sight. I mean, yes, they're there to support Zelensky, but he was the one that laid the groundwork for that to try to get peace.
Right. About half a dozen European leaders here today at the White House. Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, also the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, French President Emmanuel Macron. Of course, though, this comes after President Trump had his own meeting on Friday with Russian President Vladimir Putin. And he spoke about giving the Russian president a call today once these meetings wrapped up. Jeannie, we want to play you what he said and get your reaction on the other side.
I spoke indirectly with President Putin today. We're going to call President Putin right after this meeting. I'm sure we're going to have a solid meeting, good meeting, maybe a great meeting, and we're going to try and work out a trilat after that and see if we can get it finished, put this to sleep.
Jeannie, what sort of pressure is this White House under, and how have we seen the messaging from the White House pushing forward for a deal here, as we now have President Trump saying that potentially there could be a trilateral meeting, but we've yet to get any sort of indications that that is actually going to ultimately happen?
Yeah, one of the most important things that happened on Friday was when the president came out and didn't take questions, but made the statement that this is now up to the Ukraine and Russia. It was almost a sort of realization on his part that for all of his talking about him pushing a peace plan, it really is not something he's going to be able to square because these two sides are too far together. And so today he's talking about this trilateral meeting, and there has never been an indication, in fact, quite the opposite, from Vladimir Putin, who has said he won't meet with Vladimir Zelenskiy until an agreement is worked out. In fact, he doesn't even see Vladimir Zelenskiy as the head of Ukraine. He says he is there. He has not called an election, obviously, because of the war. And so Vladimir Putin has even questioned if they come to an agreement, who would sign that piece of paper. So the idea that anybody thinks there's going to be a trilateral meeting anytime soon, I think is not something we're going to see, because Vladimir Putin got everything he wanted on Friday. Continue the war and no economic pressure from the United States. And unless that comes, it's not likely he's going to change his mind anytime soon.
Ashley, does President Trump have any leverage in this situation with Vladimir Putin to try to bring him along to whatever he might be hearing from Volodymyr Zelensky and European leaders today?
Absolutely. The secondary sanctions, the sanctions that we're threatening. I mean, I think, and what people have reported and are thinking, is that the only reason he's at the table is because of China and because of India and Brazil, right? So he's holding back Congress from putting those secondary sanctions in place. And so this is a money game at this point. And so, yeah, I think we do have power, and he's trying to, right or wrong how people agree with how he's doing it, I mean, he's trying something. This has been going on for 3.5 years. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. So why aren't we, trying to support it? Otherwise, he's, being criticized for not supporting it.
Well, Jeannie, just in our last 30 seconds here, would love your take also on this idea of leverage, this idea of so-called secondary sanctions. We've already seen them put into place against India. President Trump says for now he's going to hold off on China. Where do we see this going when we are looking at the bigger picture here for geopolitical ties? Yeah, very tough for him to put secondary sanctions on China, because they have leverage over us. And you talk about this so much, Tyler, in terms of rare earth minerals, for instance. So it's going to be tough. That's why we went into the summit on Friday, because the president wanted to put those on, and he realized on the 8th deadline he couldn't do it. They called this meeting, and Marco Rubio said over the weekend it doesn't seem imminent. So I think the president realizes what most of us realize is our leverage is running very thin at this point.
Jeannie Shanzano and Ashley Davis, thank you. To read more about these stories and more, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
It was a big day here in Washington. A lot of different news threads to follow, Mike. But of course, one of the biggest ones, this meeting here happening at the White House, as it's our understanding those European leaders are still there.
Yes, and we'll be keen to know what emerges from this and what the next steps are going from here. There's so much at stake, given the bloodshed that we have seen over the past 3.5 years. And for Ukraine, it's an existential question.
Right, exactly. Well, we'll be following this into tomorrow. Thanks so much for joining us on Balance of Power tonight. This is Bloomberg. Michael Shepard and I will be right back here. Check us out on the early edition starting at 12 p.m. Eastern on Bloomberg Radio.